The Honourable Member for Churchill, Kiwatnook-Askey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm tremendously honoured to rise in this House to speak in favour of a powerful Opposition Day motion that I'm proud comes from our party, the NDP. And I want to acknowledge the particular work of my colleague, the Member of Parliament for Timmins, James Bay, and my colleague, the MP for Nunavik, James Bay, EU. And I want to be clear and place on the record that today's Opposition Day motion is in responding to the call of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to move our nation on a path of true healing for the crimes of the residential school era. We, the House, invite Pope Francis to participate in this journey with Canadians by responding to Call to Action 58 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and issue a formal papal apology for the role of the Canadian Catholic Church in the establishment, operations, and abuses of the residential schools. We also call upon the Canadian Catholic Church to live up to their moral obligations and the spirit of the 2006 Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement and resume best efforts to raise the full amount of the agreed-upon funds. And finally, to call on the Catholic entities that were involved in the running of the residential schools to make a consistent and sustained effort to turn over relevant documents when called upon by survivors of residential schools, their families, and scholars working to understand the full scope of the horrors of the residential school system in the interest of truth and reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, as somebody who comes from northern Manitoba, who grew up in Thompson, which is on the traditional territory of the Nissichawasi Cree Nation, on Treaty 5 territory, anyone that grows up in our north is exposed to the trauma and to the kind of the devastating experiences that so many faced going through residential schools and that so many generations following residential school survivors have faced as well. I remember from a young age visiting with elders across our north who talked about the residential school system and what it meant to be ripped away from your family, what it meant to go to a school where you were punished for speaking your own language. And I remember hearing references to abuse, the kind of abuse that we couldn't even imagine. Growing up, I grew up with kids who talked about their grandparents going to residential schools and what that meant in terms of losing the kind of bonds with their culture, with their traditions, and the absolute interest and passion to reconnect with those traditions, to reconnect with their language, to reconnect with their roots. A reconnection that they wanted to make because it was so important to them, but unfortunately a reconnection that they had to make because the Canadian state, in cooperation with churches for decades, broke that critical connection. And Mr. Speaker, as I began to pursue activism in the political realm, some of my greatest mentors, most inspiring mentors, were residential school survivors. People that went through, as I said, unspeakable abuse and trauma, and yet went on to find great strength in leading their people, in leading their nations, in fighting back. And I'm reminded of people like Elder Robinson in Cross Lake, who, a residential school survivor himself, having gone through all of the challenges that so many survivors have gone through, went on to be one of the people that helped create the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood. And he talked about the importance of being engaged. He talked about the importance of reconnecting with their tradition. He talked about the importance of fighting for self-determination. And he went on to be an incredible champion when it came to fighting against the devastation we saw from Manitoba Hydro and fighting the kind of the ongoing colonial policies put forward by Ottawa and successive governments. And his legacy continues to live on. In fact, many of his children have gone on to leadership. Many of them are leaders, both elected and community leaders in Cross Lake and in other communities in our province. And I'm reminded that out of great difficulty came immeasurable strength that inspired me and many others to carry on the struggle to build a better world for First Nations and for Northern Manitobans. And Mr. Speaker, as I visit communities, as I visited over the years, I've spent a fair bit of time hearing stories about the devastation of residential schools in our area. And I'm sad to say that many of those residential schools were run by the Catholic Church. And it's extremely disappointing. It's frankly angering that the Catholic Church is putting up barriers when it comes to making the most simple act of reconciliation a reality, the act of an apology. And this is, it really hits home, because a lot of the time that I spend in our north is I cross the areas in which the residential schools once stood. Places like where the Guy Hill Residential School used to be, a school that existed in northern Manitoba from 1926 to 1979, Mr. Speaker. Just 3 years before I was born, this residential school continued to exist. A residential school that thousands of young people from across our region attended, and where many experienced unbelievable abuse. The Guy Hill Residential School is known for many things, but when you spend just a few moments looking at their records, you can tell very quickly that a lot of what happened there was completely unacceptable. There are records from 1951 that indicated that this school is woefully overcrowded. And I note that the double-deck beds which were recommended are still lacking, was indicated in the records. From a health point of view, though, this would be a material benefit to children. The documents at that time in 1951, also noted that there's a rather serious epidemic which has affected 19 boys of various ages. This may turn out to be tuberculosis. In 1958, the records at that time indicated that water at the new school was contaminated and, quote, found to be dangerous as it contains bacteria usually found in sewage, unquote. A year later, in 1959, the water at the school was still unhealthy to consume. And yet, the children that attended that school were forced to consume it and were forced to live in those conditions. I'm reminded of the work of Adam Mosby and other researchers and academics who've talked about the way in which children underwent not just treacherous conditions, but oftentimes were forced, without their knowledge, of course, to undergo experiments with respect to malnutrition and with respect to living in substandard conditions. And to know that this was the reality in some of these schools, and to know that this was on record at that time, and yet these conditions persisted, and that kind of abuse continued to go on. And there were other schools, residential schools in our area. The Fort Alexander Residential School in the south end of my constituency, the constituency that I represent. It was indicated that in 1963, in a letter at that time, a Fort Alexander student expressed fear at returning to the institution because he alleged frequent rebukes by staff and the likelihood of corporal punishment upon return. These are the stories we hear all too often, of beatings, of physical abuse, of sexual abuse, abuse that would not be imaginable, never mind tolerated, imaginable in any setting, let alone an educational setting. And I've heard many of those stories and the way in which those have everlasting impacts on survivors, and how many have struggled with the trauma that's come from that, and some have turned to alcohol and substance abuse to be able to get away from those traumatic memories, those traumatic experiences. And here we are knowing that in 1963 and 1958, on the record, it indicated that students, young people, were forced into these conditions. This is unacceptable, without question, Mr. Speaker. One residential school that is well known in our region for the kind of inhumane conditions that existed. Another residential school run by the Catholic Church was the one in Cross Lake. And again, there's a fair bit of information on the record from 1918 all the way to 1949 that there were serious issues taking place at this residential school. In 1943, a doctor insisted that the spread of tuberculosis at the Cross Lake Indian Residential School was the result of poor air quality and overcrowding in the dormitories. As a result, the federal government advised the church that no more than 80 children be kept in residence at the Cross Lake Indian Residential School during the 1943 and 1944 school year. In 1944 and 45, during the late fall and early winter, almost all the children at the Cross Lake Indian Residential School were infected with jaundice. A medical officer linked the epidemic to overcrowding in the dormitories, with the school population at 96 students, which he strongly condemned. And so here you hear that, respected professionals were on the record as saying that these were inhumane conditions, that children were getting sick as a result, and yet the church and the government continued to oversee these inhumane conditions. Now, and with respect to Cross Lake, it's a story we hear often back home up north. That many people felt a real sense of justice when students actually set fire to that residential school, and everybody was able to get out safely. But there's talk of how students took it in their own hands to put an end to a place that was causing them so much hurt. And Mr. Speaker, just the idea that children lived in those conditions, away from their families, ripped apart from their culture, from their community, and put to face inhumane conditions, unspeakable abuse, is absolutely shocking. And so, Mr. Speaker, that brings me back to what we're here discussing today. A motion that really reflects the desire, I believe, certainly of our party, and I understand of other parliamentarians as well, to begin to address the wrongs through a formal apology from the Catholic Church. We know other churches have taken this step, and it's deeply frustrating to many people, I know from those that are of the Catholic faith, but others as well, that the Catholic Church is still not willing to apologize. I know many are hopeful, given the fact that the current Pope, Pope Francis, has been rather progressive and open-minded when it comes to notions of reconciliation, and work that he's done in Latin America has indicated as such. And so we feel that there is an opening there, a possibility there to begin that road of reconciliation with respect to survivors of Catholic residential schools. And it's disappointing that because of certain barriers that are being placed by senior officials in the Catholic Church, that it is up to Parliament to reflect where Canadians are at and to ask for this apology. But here we are. It is time for us to show leadership on this front. And Parliament has done so a few times on this important issue. I'm reminded of the national apology in 2006. I'm reminded of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that had the support of Parliament. And it's only fitting that despite the challenges, that we once again call for this kind of action by the Catholic Church. And I will say it's incumbent on us to do so, given the fact that Parliament unfortunately oversaw this kind of unspeakable abuse through its support of the residential school system. That this is what we're doing here today is one small, very small step in saying that that we know that the history that has gone before us is a history that is wrong, that many wrongs were done, and that we as parliamentarians today in 2018 must take leadership and encourage those that had the ultimate responsibility to take a moment to say that they're sorry and to begin, like I said, that path of reconciliation. The government apologized, it was in 2008, and the various churches, except for the Catholic Church, have apologized. And it's important to know that the call to action 58 in the Truth and Reconciliation indicated explicitly that a papal apology was seen as key to the process of reconciliation, and it is time that the Pope delivered one. Popes have made similar apologies to Irish victims of Catholic abuse in 2010, to the Indigenous peoples of the Americas for the Church's role in colonization, and that was in 2015 by the current Pope, and to victims of abuse in Chile on April 11th, earlier this year. The residential school system was created by religious organizations and governments together. And through this motion, we, Parliament, are calling on our fellow partners in the residential school system, the Catholic Church, to apologize formally. And I will say that the Government of Canada inappropriately let the Church off the hook for a significant part of its financial obligations under the 2006 Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. They were obligated to pay $79 million and were discharged from paying back $37.8 million. The government and church were both defendants in the actions that led to the Indian residential school system or process and for survivors, and we believe that it was wrong that they were let off the hook when it comes to paying this money back. Monsieur le Président, il faut reconnaître qu'on a une occasion ici comme député, comme Parlement, de faire ce qu'il faut faire, de non corriger l'histoire. C'est une histoire traumatique, une histoire très négative de notre pays, mais de encourager ceux qui sont responsables de commencer leur approche à la réconciliation. Et c'est pour ça qu'on demande que le Parlement appuie une motion unanimement pour demander que le pape, que l'Église catholique offre l'opportunité aux survivants de pouvoir avancer vers la réconciliation ensemble. Mr. Speaker, I rise in this House thinking of survivors, including my colleague, the MP from Nunavik, James Bay, EU, thinking of the survivors at home, so many that have passed, thinking of those that the children and the grandchildren of survivors, some of whom, as friends of mine, have, like I said, told me about the devastating intergenerational impacts of residential schools. And I will say that as a new parent myself, the idea that so many parents had their children ripped away from them, had their culture and their traditions taken from them, stolen from them, were put to face unspeakable abuse is unfathomable. And that's why I take this opportunity as a member of Parliament, as somebody who's proud to come from where I come from, to say this is our moment in time to show leadership. This is our moment in time as parliamentarians to send a unanimous message that the Catholic Church, that the Pope must apologize and must begin this journey of reconciliation with survivors. It is time. Survivors deserve it. First Nations deserve it. And we hope that, that through this motion, this day will come soon. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Spadina, North York. Or sorry, Spadina.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the member opposite for wise words and good words that clearly link not just the experience and the trauma and the tragedy and the horror of the residential school system to the ongoing systemic problems that continue to plague this country as it moves towards truth and reconciliation, and quite clearly it hasn't arrived there yet. And I draw attention to the call to action number 1, the one that's focused on child welfare and the elimination and the reduction of children in the child welfare system. The member opposite from Manitoba drew parallels from the residential school system to the situation in Manitoba now. Manitoba, as we know, has had one of the most aggressive and one of the most tragic child welfare systems. Good people trying to do good work, but nonetheless, we have effectively outsourced the residential school system. We have privatized it in the sense that we have apprehended close to 11,000 children in her province over the last 10, 15 years. A provincial government with good intention, but with clearly bad practice that also has taken children from their families, from their culture, from their community. And I'm wondering, as we move towards truth and reconciliation, it's not just the Catholic Church that needs to revisit apologies. The provincial government made one, but over the last 10 years, has replicated the system of taking children from their families, and we know that of the 11,000 kids in Manitoba, close to 86% are of Indigenous heritage. Does the member opposite have words for the previous provincial government and its cabinet in terms of what they should do to revisit their apology to make sure we don't replicate the system in a new form and not simply focus on the bad deeds of the Catholic Church here today?
The honourable member for Churchill, Kiiwetinoong-Aski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there's no question that that the intergenerational trauma of residential schools, the broken nature of many families, the struggles that many parents face is still with us today. And yes, we can see it through the child welfare system and a system that has too often hurt rather than helped. You know, and I will acknowledge that that many have had to learn from the mistakes of how things were run. But I will speak to the fact that representing a number of the communities where children are taken away from, you will hear from parents that the reasons why they're unable to raise their kids with the support that they need is because you know, they're struggling with addictions, or because they're struggling in abject poverty. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask, where was the federal government, or where has the federal government, both successive Liberal and Conservative governments, been when it comes to addressing the absolute underfunding of key services like housing, like education, like health care? And why is it that unfortunately too many First Nations live in third world conditions, rendering the raising of strong families and healthy children a major challenge? So if we're going to get at the root of preventing apprehension, we need to talk about building stronger communities by addressing underfunding immediately, and that starts with the federal government stepping up and living up to its obligations.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we have talked briefly about the three components of this motion. Of course, the one is the apology, the second is the financial, but the third is about the records. And I'm wondering if my colleague could talk a little bit further around why they felt that having that was an important part of the motion that we're talking about today.
The honourable member for Churchill, Kiiwetinoong-Aski.
Yes, absolutely, and this is an important component. The access to records is an important component. I know my colleague, the Member of Parliament for Timmins, James Bay, has been a very strong advocate with respect to the survivors of the St. Anne's Residential School, and has pointed out that despite time and time again, he's pointed out, despite this government's commitment to reconciliation and working with survivors, they are fighting the St. Anne's survivors in the courts. And, you know, and if we're going to really talk about reconciliation, that kind of action is unacceptable. So that's why we've included this measure here with respect to access to relevant documents. And what we're saying is that that the survivors, whether it's of St. Anne's or any other school, deserve to see justice, and certainly don't deserve to be fought by their own federal government.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the past couple of weeks we have seen a little bit of confusion coming from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, who have tried to explain the lack of an apology or no apology forthcoming from the Pope is because they've explained it that it was the responsibility, the residential schools fell under different orders of the Catholic Church. But I think to Catholics, to people who are non-Catholic, when you look at the institution of the Catholic Church, I think everyone universally agrees that the recognized spiritual head of the Catholic Church is the Pope. And would my colleague not agree, would she agree with me in saying that, you know, the Catholic bishops in Canada, I think their explanations are a little bit misplaced. We're looking for a way to go forward. We're not trying to assign blame. But part of moving forward as a country means accepting your organization's responsibility in the administration of this school system in Canada. And I think this Pope, with what he has done around the world, acknowledging and apologizing for previous abuses, I think that you know, he could very well find it within his heart to come forward in this. And so I would just like to hear my honourable colleagues' comments on that, and just why this particular apology from the Pope, as the recognized spiritual head of the Catholic Church, is so important for us to move forward as a nation on this very issue.
Member for Churchill, Kiwatnook Aski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for this important question. And that is why our motion is very much focused on the Pope, a Pope that has indicated some real openness when it comes to apologizing for past wrongs and for beginning a process of reconciliation. He's done so in other parts of the world. It's time that we see that in Canada. We know other churches have done that. It's time for the Catholic Church to begin on this journey as well. It's deeply frustrating to see that senior officials have been trying to, I guess, dodge this responsibility for quite some time. Survivors want to see an apology. It wouldn't be in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission if that weren't the case. We need to take that very seriously, that it is a call to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that's why we're pushing for it here in Parliament. It has to be done. It's something that's been asked for of survivors, and it's part of that road to reconciliation. And I will also say that, you know, for many survivors, you know, an apology is definitely not enough, and that's why, you know, we've indicated that that there's a moral obligation to live up to, and that they need to make their best efforts to raise the full amount of the agreed upon funds. We've also indicated the ongoing need we've called for documents to be made available with respect to the St. Anne's case and the ongoing battles for justice from residential school survivors. And so it's, you know, what we're calling for here is what we've heard time and time again from survivors. It's time for Parliament to respect these wishes. It's time for Parliament to stand up and defend the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this is why this motion is before us today. And I couldn't be more proud that it is the NDP that's putting this forward.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Winnipeg North. We have time for a very brief question, 45-second question, 45-second answer. If you don't mind.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that I've really appreciated thus far in the debate today is that there is this sense of nonpartisan, that we in fact look at the issue and it appears as if we could even potentially get unanimous support. And how important it is that when we're communicating our messages as much as possible, that we hope that the Pope will, in fact, respond favorably, given just the dynamic of what's taking place in the House of Commons today. And I would ask for my colleague and friend across the way to provide her thoughts on that.
Honourable member for Churchill, Chiwatnook Aski.
It would be a powerful message for us to show unanimous support for this motion, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, parliamentarians, unfortunately, Parliament for decades oversaw the running of the residential school system. It's time that we take these moments to begin a different journey, that of reconciliation, to continue and to begin in the case of Catholic residential school survivors, and there couldn't be any stronger message than one of unanimous support. And I believe that, and many of us believe that there's an openness again from the Pope to begin this process of an apology, and that's why if we all come together, the message couldn't be stronger. Thank you.